to take a rest from all of the other things that might be weighing us down, whether it's politics at the national level. I know as we prayed for earlier, there's been a lot of people with unrest on both sides of the issue. So I know we're here this morning with heavy hearts with what's going on there. We might have heavy hearts with things that are going on in our own families, in our own neighborhoods, our own personal lives. But it's good to come here together, especially on this Sabbath when we get to celebrate the Lord's Supper together and we get to take a moment and simply put the cares of the world aside and focus in on what truly matters, what's the utmost importance, and that is our Savior, Jesus Christ. Today we are here to learn, to worship, to sing, to praise, and we're going to be continuing on in our series on the covenants of grace. We're going to be looking at the signs when it comes to these covenants. What do you do when you want to remember something? A lot of us pull out our cell phones, program in a reminder, maybe turn on the alarm, so that we can get a reminder of something that is important to us that we need to remember. Do any of you do that? Yes, right? But what if you need to remember something more long-term? What if there's something or someone in your life that you want to commemorate on a much longer term scale than just simply setting a reminder in your phone? What do you do then? A lot of people today get tattoos. They get tattoos to remember, to remind them of something special or someone special. But even tattoos have only a limited span, right? Maybe your skin gets a little wrinkly and you can't remember, it doesn't look exactly the same. Those words get a little funky looking. But more than that, we don't last forever. We don't live forever. So what happens if you want to remember something that lasts longer than your lifetime? Well, some people commission a statue to be built to remember that special person, someone of significance in their lives, or maybe a thing to commemorate something that's happened. Or perhaps you can donate a lot of money to get your name on a building. But whatever the case may be, all of these things are signs to help us remember the important things, to remember the important people, to remember the important events that have happened to us in our lives. As we've been studying about the covenants, and we've seen that there's this everlasting covenant that stretches pretty much from the beginning of time to the end of time, and that these covenants, while they have different components, they've all been connected in this overarching framework of grace. And these covenants and the everlasting covenant and their various components, they're very important. We've been studying about their importance, learning about the importance of the covenants. And so because they're important, it makes sense that God would give us something to remember them by. That God would give us signs to help us remember the significance and the importance of these covenants and of the everlasting covenant of grace. Let's see if you can remember. Put your thinking caps back on. Do you remember the four major components of the Old Testament period? Who are the four covenants made with in the Old Testament? Abraham, that's one. Noah, that's two. Moses, and the people and the Israelites at Sinai. And one more. King David, yes, look, you smart people here, got all four. All right, so of these four, we're going to look at the signs that are connected. Actually, there's signs for three of them. The covenant that God made with David was really for him and his family, even though it impacted the rest of the covenant people. But God gives signs for these other three covenants because they were very important aspects of the covenant for the larger scope of God's covenant people. And we're going to see that these signs are important because God's covenant signs are lasting reminders of His grace. God wants us to remember his covenant because the framework, the DNA of his covenant has always been and will always be grace. And so he gives us these signs to help us remember his grace. So the first covenant we talked about is the Noack Covenant, the covenant that God enters into with Noah at the time of the flood. Do you know what the sign might be? Well, let's look. It's found in Genesis chapter 9, verses 11 to 13. God's talking to Noah, and he says, I establish my covenant with you. Never again will all life be destroyed by the waters of a flood. Never again will there be a flood to destroy the earth. And God said, this is the sign of the covenant I am making between me and you and every living creature with you, a covenant for all generations to come. I have set my rainbow in the clouds, and it will be the sign of the covenant between me and the earth. So what is the sign? Rainbows, exactly. This is the first sign that God gives of his covenant. He says, I'm putting this rainbow in the sky so that every time you see it, you're going to remember that I will never again destroy the earth through flood. No matter how bad things might get, no matter how wicked your hearts might be, you will always find grace. This is my promise to you. And in fact, God says this is going to be an everlasting sign. This is part of his everlasting covenant. And we see that rainbows are going to be there throughout history, throughout past this world's history. We catch glimpses of this throughout Scripture. In fact, we read about it in Revelation chapter 4, verse 3. John, the Revelator, John gets a vision of heaven and the majesty and the glory of God, and he writes about this in verse 3, and he says, and the one, speaking about God, who sat there had the appearance of jasper and ruby, a rainbow that shone like an emerald encircled the throne. And so we see glimpses here in Revelation and other places in the New Testament, Old Testament, where prophets get visions of heaven and God and the throne room, that there's this connection with God and these rainbows that are going to last as perpetual reminders that God gives grace to his people, that God always has his people's back, that God is always willing and ready to save his special covenant children. That's the first sign, rainbows. And these rainbows help us to remember God's wonderful grace. The second covenant is the Abrahamic Covenant, the covenant that God enters into with Abraham. And it has a special relationship, a special connection with Abraham. And he says, Abraham, I want to use you to bless the entire world. And he says, and here is the sign of our covenant. We read about it in Genesis 17, verses 12 to 13. For the generations to come, every male among you who is 8 days old must be circumcised, including those born in your household or bought with money from a foreigner, those who are not your offspring. My covenant in your flesh is to be an everlasting covenant. And so this is the second sign, circumcision. I was trying to find a good picture to illustrate this sign. And after looking for some pictures online of circumcision, I decided to save all of us some grief and just show a worried-looking baby here. But this is the sign between Abraham and God, that God enters into this covenant with Abraham, and he says the sign is circumcision. And so people think that, well, that's been done away with. We don't need to worry about circumcision anymore. And in fact, if you remember a few weeks ago, that's exactly what happened at the Council of Jerusalem. When new people were wanting to become followers of Christ, a lot of the original Christians who were Jews, they said, well, first you have to become Jews in order to become Christian. And so the only way for you to become a Jew is to become circumcised. And so other people say, well, that's not really, I don't think that's true. And so they got together and they studied and they prayed and they had this Council of Jerusalem, and it was decided that Gentiles did not have to become Jews first in order to become Christians. And so then the question becomes, well, didn't the verse we just read, it said that my sign in your flesh is going to be an everlasting covenant? what is happening here? Unfortunately, a lot of people think that circumcision is just a physical thing. But actually, it's physical and spiritual. This is why you find throughout Scripture, God references circumcision of the heart. And we see this actually in display in Romans chapter 4, verse 9 to 11. Paul's writing to the Christians in Rome, and he says this to them: "We have been saying that Abraham's faith was credited to him as righteousness. Under what circumstances was it credited? Was it after he was circumcised or before? It was not after, but before. So then, Abraham is the father of all who believe, but have not been circumcised, in order that righteousness might be credited to them." Paul's saying to the Christians, he said, it's not circumcision that made Abraham righteous. That really wasn't the part. What made him righteous was his faith. What made him righteous was his heart, that it was connected to God. There's nothing about circumcision that's going to save you. You don't find salvation through circumcision. You find salvation through having your heart connected to Christ. And this is why God talks about, all the way, even starting in Deuteronomy, towards the very beginning of the Bible, the fact that he wants our hearts to be circumcised, not simply our physical bodies. To help clarify things, Skip McCarty, an Adventist pastor and author, he writes in his book, In Granite or Ingrained, "Many believers in God's New Covenant historical period, many of us who live in this New Covenant era, like for us in 2018, have had their sons circumcised, not as meritorious acts, but for health reasons. It's not the physical act itself, but the motivation behind it that determines its value and significance." He's saying, it's not that sign of circumcision is not there anymore. You don't have to do it in order to show that you're in a covenant relationship with God. You can go ahead and do it or choose that for your sons now because of health reasons or medical reasons, but it's not a necessary thing in order to show that you are in a covenant relationship with God. And so the question then becomes, if circumcision said it was supposed to be an everlasting thing, and the Council of Jerusalem said that it stopped, or it's not necessary anymore, was there another sign that came along to take its place? And the answer is yes. Anyone have a guess as to what that new sign is? It's baptism. Baptism. And while baptism isn't referred to as an explicit sign of the covenant, we see that the circumcision served as the initiation ceremony for people to become part of God's covenant people in the Old Covenant era. They said, I want to follow God. I want to be in a covenant relationship with Him. So how do I do it? How do I join that group? And the way to join them was through circumcision. But now, in the New Testament era, in the New Covenant era, people say, I want to have a relationship with God. I want to be in a covenant relationship with Him. How do I go about it? How do I initiate the process? And it's through baptism. Baptism has replaced that initiation ceremony for us in the New Covenant era. And along those same lines, that was the initiation part. There's a continual part. There's something that people would do to continually remind themselves that they were in a covenant relationship with God. In the Old Covenant era, that continual reminder was the system of animal sacrifices. Right? Every once in a while, you would sin and you would want to seek God's forgiveness. And you say, well, we're in a covenant relationship, God, and you've promised that you're going to forgive me, so I'm going to offer this animals as a sacrifice. And in our context, in 2018, in the New Covenant era, the continual reminder of our covenant relationship with God is what we have gathered here this morning to do, to celebrate the Lord's Supper. We gather together as Seventh-day Adventists 4 times a year to remember the fact that God is forgiving us. Just as the animal sacrifices pointed forward to Christ's ultimate sacrifice, the communion meal reflects back. It provides us an opportunity to remember the ultimate sacrifice that Christ paid for us on the cross. And so it would look like this if you put in a little bit of a graphic format. And the initiation ceremony in the Old Testament was circumcision. The initiation ceremony in the New Testament is baptism. The continuing ceremony in the Old Testament is animal sacrifice, but the continuing ceremony in the New Testament is communion, or the Lord's Supper. Does that make sense? And so we're gathered here this morning to remember this God's grace, to celebrate this meal because it serves as a sign, as all God's covenant signs do, to remind us of His grace. God's covenant signs are lasting reminders of His grace. And so we come to the third sign, the third component of the everlasting covenant, which is the Sinaitic covenant, the covenant that God enters into with Moses and the children of Israel at Mount Sinai. And we find that the sign of this covenant is found in Exodus chapter 31, verses 16 and 17. The Israelites are to observe the Sabbath, celebrating it for the generations to come as a lasting covenant. It will be a sign between me and the Israelites forever. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, and on the seventh day He rested and was refreshed. And so what is the sign here? The sign is the seventh-day Sabbath. It's finding Sabbath rest and a weekly connection with God. And we see this, and unfortunately, some Christians, they read that passage we just read and say, well, God just talks about the Israelites. God was entering into this covenant with just the Israelites. And so that's no longer applicable, to us in 2018. But as the past several weeks, as we've been studying the covenant, we've seen that that's not necessarily the case, that a lot of the old covenant stuff was just for the era, from the historical perspective, but it's really about the experience that travels through. And we see that this Sabbath sign, the seventh Sabbath observance, is one of those parts that is not just simply about the old covenant historical era. It's part of the sign of everyone, for everyone in every generation that continues to be in a covenant relationship with God. For example, we read about this in Isaiah chapter 56, verse 6 and 7. God is speaking through the Old Testament prophet Isaiah, and He says, and foreigners, for the people that aren't Jews, the people that are Gentiles, the visitors, for the foreigners who bind themselves to the Lord, to minister to Him, to love the name of the Lord, and to be His servants, all who keep the Sabbath without desecrating it, and who hold fast to my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain, and give them joy in my house of prayer. He says that everyone who wants to be a follower of God, everyone that wants to be in a covenant relationship with God, is going to have this experience on the seventh-day Sabbath. It's going to have this sign that they are followers, that they are lovers, that they are friends of God. And we see this more. We'll be talking about this in a couple of weeks and digging more in depth after this series, The Appearing, is over. But this is just a preview, because we see that Isaiah is saying that it's applicable. The Sabbath is a wonderful sign available to everyone. And we see that even in creation, that God gave the Sabbath to everyone, to humanity, not just, this was way before there was such a thing as Jews and Gentiles. It was just a people. God has always intended the Sabbath to be a sign to everyone and a gift to everyone that wants to follow, believe, and be saved by Him. God's covenant signs are lasting reminders of His grace. And so this morning, we have the opportunity to partake in one of those signs. This morning, we have the chance to celebrate and partake in the Lord's Supper, which is this part of the new covenant sign that we remember and we reflect on the broken body and the shed blood of Jesus. That His ultimate act of sacrifice provides us with the ultimate experience of grace. And so today I invite you to stay by and participate in these emblems, to partake of the bread and the new wine as we remember and we reflect on the grace that is provided for us at the cross. Before we partake in the Lord's Supper, though, we want to do another ordinance. We're going to partake in the ordinance of humility or foot washing service. I know this is not a super popular thing in a lot of other Christian circles, But Jesus has asked us, we take his model as that Last Supper, as he went around and he washed his disciples' feet. He washed the feet of everyone, from Peter, who is outspokenly faithful, to Judas, who would ultimately betray him. Jesus humbled himself, took the form of a servant, and washed his followers' feet. And so for us, before we partake in the Lord's Supper, we have an opportunity to wash someone else's feet, to remind us that we're not the king of anyone, that we're not the boss of anyone, that if God, the creator and sustainer of the world, can humble himself and wash his servants' feet, then how much more are we called to serve others?